So in the first set of example videos, we went through a basic example where the net operating income and the selling price was given to us, and we just had to divide to get the rate of return. But what if we don't have the net operating income? Well, no big deal, just a couple more steps. Remember, if we don't have the net operating income, then we're going to start with gross potential. We'll subtract off vacancy, we'll subtract off operating expenses, and we'll get that net operating income. And then we can figure out a rate of return. So here's a very typical style of example. Comparable ABC has gross potential rents of $124,000, operating expenses of $44,000, and a sale price of $635,930. Comparable XYZ has gross potential rent of $138,000, operating expenses of $50,000, and a sale price of $711,000. The long-term vacancy rate is 4%. Based on this, what's the market yield estimated to be between? So, okay, a good amount of information, but don't get overwhelmed. We got two comparables. Wonderful. Remember, the more comparables we have, the better it is because we get a more accurate estimate of the subject. You just deal with each one on its own. So let's look at ABC to begin with. If we want to figure out a rate of return for ABC, well, we have to first get its net operating income. So remember again, gross potential minus vacancy minus OPEX. That's straightforward. So gross potential income of ABC, $124,000. We will subtract off 4%. So if you have your calculator, 124,000 minus 4, and hit that percent button, then equals 124,000 minus 4% equals, that's gross realized income. And from there, we will subtract off the operating expenses, which is $44,000. And in a 1, 2, 3-step approach, we figure out that the net operating income, $75,040. That's it. What means is what we already know. Net operating income divided by ABC's selling price tells us its rate of return. Well, ABC sold for $635,930, which means it's earning 11.8%. Remember, on your calculator, you'll see 0.118. 0.118 means 11.8%, just like 0.1 means 10%. So don't get confused by the decimals. Yep, on your screen you're going to see 0.118, but that means 11.8%. Wonderful. Let's do the exact same thing for XYZ. Same steps. If we want to get net operating income, it starts with gross potential. We subtract off vacancy and subtract off OPEX. So gross potential on XYZ, 138,000. So 138,000 minus 4% gets us to gross realized, and then we subtract off OPEX of $50,000. So we end up with 82,480. Okay. Again, I know that net operating income divided by selling price gives me the rate of return. So 82,000 divided by 711,000, 11.6%. Or again, on your screen, you're going to see 0.116. But again, remember what that means. So that means that a subject property should fall somewhere in the range of 11.6 to 11.8% as a rate of return. Remember, rate of returns for similar projects are not exactly the same. They're close. And the more comps we have, the better we can get that estimate. So now we have a range. Wonderful. So let's take this one step further. In the first examples, we were given all the information. In the second set of examples that we just did, we had to figure out the net operating income number first, then to get a rate of return. And in this next example, we're going to use that rate of return to figure out the value of a subject property. So here again is a very typical style of example. Consider the following data related to recently sold property A. So it's a comp. It is comparable to the subject property B, whose value is to be appraised. Wonderful. So A sold for $210,000. The gross potential income of A is $45,000, while B is earning $54,000. The vacancy rate for A, $4,500. So they've given it to us in dollar amounts here, but if you look at the math, you can tell that's 1%, 10%, I apologize. And B is $5,400. Current operating expenses, A, 30 grand, B, $36,000. So, don't get overwhelmed here again. Remember, the comp is going to set the basis for the subject. So let's work with the comp first. That's A. We have to figure out a rate of return for A, which means the first thing we have to do is get its net operating income. Gross potential, minus vacancy, minus operating expenses. That's what we're starting with here. So, the gross potential income of A, $45,000. Subtract off $4,500 for vacancy and subtract off $30,000 for operating expenses means we're getting a net operating income of $10,500. 1, 2, 3. And I know that the net operating income divided by its selling price, which in this case was $210,000, gives me the rate of return. So $10,500 divided by $210,000, 5% or 0.05. Now I have my basis. I know that a good estimate for property B is that it also earns a rate of return of 5%. But in order to get there, I need to figure out its net operating income. But it's the exact same process. So I start with gross potential. Gross potential of B is $54,000. Subtract off the vacancy of $5,400 and subtract off the current operating expenses of $36,000. Gross potential minus vacancy minus OPEX. That means I have a net operating income on building C of $12,600. Now, I know that $12,600 divided by its selling price should give me 5%. 10 divided by 2 is equal to 5. Which means if I need to flip this formula around, I'll say 10 divided by 5 is equal to 2. Which means if I take the net operating income and divide it by the rate of return, I'll get the selling price. So I will take $12,600 and divide it by 0.05 or 5% and get $252,000. And that's the most sort of robust example. So we've taken this in sort of steps. In the first examples, we just figured out the rate of return. We were given the net operating income, we were given the selling price. In the second set of examples, we had to figure out the net operating income and then get the rate of return for a comp. And in this last example, we figure out the net operating income of a comp, figure out its rate of return, and use that as a basis for a subject property.